the goal is basically, it sounds like, to replicate a multi-story healthy forest. And it turns out that coffee is a crop that can thrive under those conditions, as well as all the other biodiversity that would come along with a healthy forest. Is that a fair statement of the goal, or the?
Yeah, so I just want to state that no coffee plantation, no matter how good it is ever going to be the same as primary forest.
Mm-hmm.
But for a landscape that does produce food for people and provide income, bird-friendly coffee is about the best the habitat could possibly be for birds. So in a bird-friendly plantation, you typically have about the same number of species that you have in coffee and the same number of birds, but the composition of that bird community is a little bit different than you would have in primary forest. But migratory bird species specifically really like shade coffee plantations because they like habitats that are a little bit disturbed. Yeah, the whole process began in 1996 with the first Sustainable Coffee Congress. So Robert Rice and Russ Greenberg from the Migratory Bird Center pulled together people that were part of coffee worldwide, but specifically focused in Latin America. And Starbucks was involved, Rainforest Alliance at the time was involved, organic certifiers were involved to think about what sustainable coffee is and how to promote it, and also how to define the science of what coffee would be best for birds and other wildlife. So that Congress led to a lot of things happening, such as Rainforest Alliance certified coffee, fair trade coffee in part came out of that meeting, and Smithsonian bird friendly coffee came out of that. So about the year 2000 is when research was finally in place to figure out and define what the best coffee plantation for birds looked like. And that's about the time that our certification started. Yeah, a couple different things. One is that coffee evolved in East Africa as an understory plant in forest. So coffee can be grown under a very closed canopy of native tree species. And traditionally, coffee was produced in these rustic plantations with basically all of the native species that were there in forest, just with the understory thinned out and coffee put in the understory. But as global demand for coffee has increased, producers are under pressure to produce more coffee on less land, and they do that by eliminating shade tree species, opening up the canopy, and planting varieties that respond well to chemical inputs, fertilizers, and also that additional light that they get by thinning out the canopy. When that happens, though, the land that that coffee is grown on no longer supports birds. So there's almost a linear drop-off in number of bird species supported on a plantation and the number of tree species that you've thinned out. So we at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center started focusing on coffee specifically because so many of our migratory bird species overwinter in the Latin American coffee belt. So for us, that was a really important place to start because we're focused on conservation of migratory bird species. But any sort of agroforestry system in the tropics has this same type of dynamic. So we're actually now expanding into cocoa, which is the crop that produces chocolate, and cocoa can also be grown in agroforestry systems. And we're in the process right now of defining what a bird-friendly cocoa plantation is and bringing a bird-friendly chocolate to market. Coffee, because it's native to East Africa, the plant itself doesn't support a super diverse insect community when it's grown in Latin America. So when we look at shade coffee plantations, even bird-friendly coffee plantations in Latin America, it's that understory bird community that typically doesn't do really well in those plantations. And that's the reason why nearby adjacent primary forest is so important. However, having native shade tree species above the coffee plants, those native tree species have evolved with a diverse insect community in Latin America. And those are the insects primarily that our migratory birds feed on when they're on the winter grounds in Latin America. And that's what they use to survive the winter and then also fuel up for migration back up to North America. So having native shade tree species is really critical to making these plantations work for birds.
What got you interested in, doing this work and trying to make it a business? And, I'm sort of interested in this idea of, trying to do well with your business and do well by the, by the environment, how, and making those things work together.
I like coffee. I like birds.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of international experience in business, and I've been lucky enough to travel around the world and meet a lot of people in a lot of different places. And I think I understand the global business world that we live in. And about the time that Ruth referenced the Congress of Shade Coffee got together, I remembered hearing something about it, and I remembered looking for Shade Coffee, and for a while you could find some Shade Coffee. And then in 2002 or 3, I can't remember exactly, we moved back. We lived in London, and we moved back to the United States. And for about 23 years before then, I hadn't lived in the United States except for in the summer. And in the summer, I lived at a little house we had, which hadn't changed in a couple hundred years, and all the birds and animals and everything were there that I grew up with. But as I started to go around the Northeast where I live, I said, gee, there aren't as many birds around as there used to be. And this is particularly true in spring, particularly true of a bird I love, the wood thrush. So I got a hold of a guy named Scott Weidensaul, who wrote a brilliant book called Living on the Wind. And one of our friends, like Katie is, and Ken Kaufman, and some other people that speak for Bird Friendly Coffee on our behalf. And I said, what's the story with the missing birds? And what's this deal about coffee? They said, oh yeah. He said, birds are declining like crazy. Migratory birds, particularly hard hit. Neotropical migrants, several disasters, including the bird that Katie's written so beautifully about, the Cerulean Warbler, are disappearing. And I said, what's this coffee connection? And so he told me a little bit about that. And I started doing some research. And so then I talked to Bob Rice, who's was one of the people with Russ Greenberg that was involved with this. Bridget was involved a little bit in the research at the beginning too, at the SMBC. And Bob had just started getting some coffee. He's very familiar with Nicaragua, knows Nicaragua very well. And he was getting some growers down there interested in the certification. So we jumped in with them, and we got the first farm in Nicaragua certified. And then there was a co-op up in the northern highlands of Nicaragua called UCA San Juan del Rio Coco. Has some very good coffee, very remote part of the country in a way, and which is good for all reasons I'll tell you that. And so we started doing business with these co-ops and this little farm, a couple of little farms down in the Carazo Plateau in Nicaragua. And with Bob Garver and David Pritchard, started figuring out what farms to buy from, what countries would give us the best coffee, and what countries were the most interesting in terms of migratory protection, and which co-ops, because we buy almost exclusively from co-ops, which co-ops were the best organized and most straight up. That this was about a lot more than birds. As much as we love birds, as much as literally birds are part of my life and have been. The first words I ever said besides mama and papa were, look, see the bird. I was pretty old when I said that. But it's really about a sustainable society. Yeah. The farmers that we work with and the co-ops that we work with are the nucleus of rural agricultural communities that can be self-sustaining. And as happened with American agriculture, as happened with European agriculture over the course of the last century, as mechanized big agri comes in, these communities, all the jobs that they support, disappear. So the alternative to shade-grown coffee is not only fewer places for migratory birds and indigenous birds to prosper. The alternative is also the desolation of rural agricultural-based communities and the families and the children and the workers. Shade coffee is much more difficult to grow. The harvest is more sequential than all at once. So it provides a lot of work for what I call skilled, semi-skilled laborers.
Mhm.
Now, coffee is easily the most important international agricultural commodity after probably rice, wheat, and maize. And it is the most successful cash crop for family farmers in the world. So what you have here is and we pay twice as much for our coffee as the big coffee guys, even the big premium brand coffee guys, because we know that unless we pay that amount of money, this type of intensively manual farming really can't be sustainable. And so when you see forests and coffee farms getting cut down to create sun coffee farms, it's really about driving yield up, driving the price of coffee down. Coffee right now in the C market is at a 10-year low.
So here's one of the birds that we're talking about. A lot of migratory songbirds. So I think that's another great aspect of this story, how doing something, you know, in Central America makes a difference throughout, you know, throughout the continent, in fact. This is a slide you sent me, Katie. What species is this again? This is
That's a chestnut-sided warbler.
Chestnut-sided warbler. And I thought that I would just go ahead and show some, you know, the Lab of Ornithology at Cornell has gorgeous data on bird migrations. So this is what, you know, you'd call this a range map based on abundance of the chestnut-sided warbler, but they have these awesome animations of the migration patterns of these species. Now, the chestnut-sided warbler is a good one because they're relatively abundant, so you can see how important this habitat is in Central America. And then, you know, you get to springtime here, and all of a sudden, it just booms. And this is based on citizen science eBird data. Now, Katie, you wrote a book called Cerulean Blues. You want to tell me, you know, just tell us how you what the basic story is and how you got interested in this.
Sure. I got interested in the Cerulean Warbler because they are one of the fastest declining songbirds in North America, probably the fastest declining songbird. And a lot of them live here in West Virginia. About 36% of the global Cerulean Warbler population breeds in West Virginia, which is really incredible. We have more Cerulean Warblers than any other state. And I got interested in that bird sort of as a bird watcher, but also as somebody who was opposed to large-scale strip mining that we do a lot of in West Virginia. Yep, there we are. And just like converting forests to a sun coffee farm, mountaintop removal coal mining converts the forest to kind of a wasteland. And then they take the mountains and blow the tops off and create these plateaus where a forest doesn't grow easily. When they're reclaimed, they're often grass. So you might have, you know, grasshopper sparrows and some other species that like grasslands, but you won't have Cerulean warblers, which is an interior forest songbird species. So I was interested in ceruleans because of the problems they were facing in their breeding habitat. And then I sort of learned about shade coffee as kind of an afterthought, that the birds were losing habitat, not just here in Appalachia where most of them breed, but also in the tropics where they're spending the winters. So they don't really get a break anywhere they go. They're losing habitat everywhere. And they go all the way to South America, to Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. And they stop over in Central America on the way to South America, and they use shade coffee farms where they stop over and then where they eventually end up to spend the winter.
Well, I love that story. To me, that's a real sort of half Earth story, how your concern about something happening locally drew you to make a connection, in a very different part of the world, but to see these connections, and obviously, migratory birds in particular are dependent on these big systems.
In bird-friendly coffee plantations in Peru, we estimate about 240 species use them, and that's compared with just about 60 species that use coffee that just has 1 or 2 shade trees over it, which is the way that most coffee globally is now produced. So, I mean, I love working with the bird-friendly coffee program because, so my background is studying golden-winged warblers. That's what I did my PhD in, and they also overwinter in coffee plantations, primarily in Central America. So during my PhD and my master's research, I spent about 8 years in Honduras and Panama doing surveys of birds in coffee plantations, and shade coffee plantations are just loaded with species, and the canopy is relatively short compared to primary forest, so you can actually see all the species and really interact with them. And one of the things I love about this program is that, so for us, we talk about our migratory bird species, but when you're in Latin America, these are also their migratory bird species.
Yes, I know. I noticed that Katie was saying it's to see our birds down there was amazing,
Yeah. So, I mean, that's how we talk about it, because of course they breed here and we see them in the summer. We think they're ours. But I've had tons of conversations with coffee farmers in Central America that ask where their birds go for certain times of the year. And they're talking about these same migratory bird species that come up to the US. And so I think it's a really powerful story that birds that breed in the US travel to areas where we get our coffee from and interact with coffee farmers that also see these birds and know these birds and really appreciate them and think about the value that they have. And another cool component of the story is that these small migratory bird species actually eat a lot of the pests of coffee. So if you have a plantation that retains bird-friendly shade above it, you are actually decreasing the cost that you need to spend on pesticides, because these migratory birds are eating a lot of the small insects that actually damage coffee. So these migratory birds are also giving a benefit to coffee farmers. Yeah, we have a couple new lines of research that we're working on right now here at the Migratory Bird Center. One is based out of Peru and Colombia right now. We're looking at which tree species specifically on bird-friendly farms support the most birds. So a research ecologist, Doug Talamay, up in the US has done a lot of work showing that not all trees are created equal when it comes to producing food for wildlife. Certain tree species like oaks, for example, have many more insects that feed on those trees. And so more species of insects and more numbers of insects are able to survive on oaks. And that makes oaks much more productive for birds than, say, a redbud tree or some other species of trees. So in the tropics, we have very little understanding of what the primary tree species that produce insects are. So we have some research right now in Peru where we're actually counting insects on trees and measuring the caloric value of the fruit they produce. And then we're looking at how that impacts where birds choose to spend their time. So if you have 20 different tree species in a shade coffee plantation, we're looking for those specific species that really matter for birds, where birds spend most of their time. And we're hoping to use that then as a recommendation for the cooperatives we work at in the area, so that they can plant and retain trees that have disproportionate value to birds. So that'll be something to make their plantation extra.